So, welcome to our session looking at the employability challenge. And I hope that your energy levels are keeping up. It's sort of difficult to stay in these rooms for a long time without any air, but I think it's raining outside, so at least that makes it easier to stay in here. We are looking here at one of the very significant challenges of our time, one that we're used to dealing with in developing countries, the challenge of having where there are massive demographic growth, and the young people are finding it difficult to not only have jobs, but have the skills for jobs, so a growing inequality between youths. There are 300 million youths between 15 and 24 unemployed in the world. And these are now starting to have a title, which I heard for the first time here. I don't know, this must be used, whether it's one that you use, the NEET title, not in employment, education, or training. And I think that's not a very neat way for young people to be, so really a serious problem. 26 million of those are in OECD countries, and this is where there is now a growing challenge, as we can see in countries where unemployment is rising quickly. As we heard before, it's just reaching 12.4% in Europe. It is a huge and growing issue, and again, one of inequality. But the issues in the different parts of the world are very, very different, and it's quite important, I think, also to make sure that we don't just take a broad brush and say it's the same in all countries. There are places where it really is a serious and growing problem. There are places that are getting it under control. If you look at OECD work on this, there are very interesting. There's interesting work going on around Germany, Austria, Chile, Korea, countries that are really managing to make a link between the working world and the educational world. But this is something that is very limited, and also where governments are finding it very difficult to find the resources and the skills to be able to handle it. So it's important that the other players come into this market, NGOs, businesses, starting to play a very, very important role in all sorts of different ways. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this session. It's, of course, not just a question of the education system per se. It's not just getting kids into schools, getting kids into universities. One of the startling things about the North African revolutions, we heard just before, they were the ones where GDP was growing. But they're also, both Tunisia and Egypt, were countries that have an enormous number of graduates who are unemployed. And in fact, the chances of being unemployed were greater for graduates, university graduates I'm talking about, than for those without a university degree. So it's also about what kind of skills there, what is happening in our education systems. And I think that that's something that we need to address in quite a differentiated way. Let me start by introducing my panel here. Have you noticed something about this panel? Isn't that amazing? It's the first time in my professional life that I've been on a panel that's not about gender, that is all women. And we're going to celebrate it in a minute with something to show you that, that we may be a little bit different. Let me just introduce you all so that you know who we're talking about. Anke, you have already met before. Anke Wittenberg, the Global Chief Diversity Officer of SAP. In the middle, we have Erin Ganju, the co-founder and CEO of Room to Read. We'll hear about exactly what these are doing, so I'm not going to describe this. Next, we have Philippa Frankel, the Executive Director of Street Kids International, and Serena Brown, we've already met this morning, the Global Development Initiative Manager of KPMG. And what we decided to do to show that we do, as a diverse group here, bring something different to the table, and this was Anke's suggestion, I have to say, is that we were thinking, we've been talking a lot about the differences between the perceptions of business and civil society, and we wanted to start by looking at the shared vision of what they're doing in this field. So we're just going to go through and have each of you talk about what the vision is in this field that drives you. So what drives you in the educational and skills training initiatives that you are pushing through. What drives you? What is the vision? What is the common theme? And we'll see if there are some commonalities between us. Thank you.
Okay, so I would get started as, I think I'm pretty pragmatic because I'm also a mom of 3, and sometimes, I'm coming pretty blonde down there. I do think what we want to do is really make the world run better, but really find solutions for issues that we have tomorrow, which means that we do have to think differently, also about what we are doing today. And I wish that we would look a little bit more about, what ideas we have that we have the same ideas, but also to have a little bit more of a best practice sharing, to really learn from each other. I would like to learn more from NGOs of how can we make really a sustainable impact also as a business, because a lot of change is coming from technology. So we are, with a lot of things, without being arrogant, we are right now in the driver's seat, but sometimes perhaps we are going the wrong way, and I would love to get more of a very honest feedback. How can we really ensure that we all go together in the right direction to find solutions that really help us tackling the issues that we have tomorrow? That's something I would really like to look a lot more into.
Thank you. Erin.
So we at Room to Read are a nonprofit, and we're dedicated to a vision where every child, no matter where they're born, has access to high-quality educational opportunities in their local communities, reaching some of the most marginalized groups in the world, who particularly work in Asia and Africa, but that allow children to then have the support to reach their full potential in life so that they can be responsible, active, empowered citizens, helping to create the solutions and the future that we all want.
It may or may not surprise people that my vision would very much mirror Erin's, actually. That it's about a vision where the potential of the youth bulge that we keep hearing about is realized, and that we see those young people as a potential and not as a problem, and that is taken forwards for the benefit of all, for those young people themselves, for their communities, for the businesses that they will ultimately either set up or work for, and that we really kind of optimize, as we've talked about earlier today, the situation that we have at the moment.
In addition to that, I would just add that for us, I think the business case is that this is an issue that massively matters to our people, many of whom are parents and feel passionate about it. It's part of a long-term vision of the children are our future, the future that we want to see. And I'd say third out of those would be we want to have a diverse workforce, and that's what will make us successful.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some shared visions. We're going to work on how we can work together. The 3 areas that I really want to look at are, in general, to look at the education system as it is. Do we need completely radical educational reform in all parts of the world in order to prepare ourselves or prepare our children? We're too late. Prepare our children for the future. Maybe we're not too late. The other question, of course, is lifelong learning. so the whole question of what needs to happen to the educational system and what role do businesses and NGOs play in that. Then I want to look generally at what NGOs can bring to the field. What can an NGO do, and what do you need to support you? What do you need from other players? And then we'll look at what business can do and what the sort of collaboration, what is happening now, what is not working, and what we would like to see for the future. Erin, let's start with you. If you could just give us all a sort of idea of what you're doing with Room to Read, so that we can understand your direction and what you're trying to do. What challenges have you faced in doing that? You're working with the educational system, so if you could also just reflect a little bit on what you feel is working with the educational systems that you are working in, and what you really need to see changed in order for your work to be made easier.
Great. Well, Room to Read works in 10 countries in Asia and Africa, as I mentioned, and we're primarily focused on 2 major issues. Literacy and the foundational skills that are required for any child to have the ability to really access ongoing education. In the developing world, the failure really is still that basic education is not being delivered in a quality way. And then gender equality in education, such that our second program is a girls' education program, ensuring that some of the most at risk of dropout part of the educational population is girls, and how to keep them in the system longer and to support them in achieving at higher rates than they are now. But I think to step back to your point of, where are we in education reform, and what are some of the challenges that Room to Read or other organizations, or more broadly the ecosystem around education faces. I think to start on a high note, and it's sometimes we only look at the challenges, it's important to see that I think more so now than ever, education actually is on the global, sort of agenda. Whether it's businesses, governments, nonprofits, it's more than ever a strong commitment, and it's growing in many areas. Things like Education for All, which a lot of governments, have signed up for in terms of universalizing education, and there is much both public, private, and nonprofit activity, and ensuring that access to education is available, is helping, is getting more and more kids in school around the world. And that's a positive sign I think is important to note. Now, the two challenges I think that are increasing, and where Room to Read or other groups come in, is really one around, you have now what's more sort of butts in seats, as they say, a lot more kids in school, but it's the quality. Kids start to drop out of school because it's not very relevant. It's not, they within the first couple of years don't get the basic quality, the basic literacy skills. That includes numeracy, not just reading, writing, comprehension, speaking. The very sort of broad definition of literacy is not being delivered in a quality way. And so the challenge is really to ensure that once we actually get more and more kids in school, is how do we help to ensure that quality? And that's where groups like Room to Read can come in, and we work only, by the way, in the government system. So we're working throughout government schools, reaching kids in the most underserved, kind of last mile, as they say, very rural, often environments, where there are not, the quality is a major issue. Teachers do not have a lot of professional development, materials, the school environment, is not strong. There's not a lot of community support for staying in school. So it's a big, it's a big issue, and it has many pieces to it, but certainly one of the areas that we work on is really enhancing teacher professional development, the quality instructional materials, the curriculum, and making it more relevant and accessible for kids. But then the other issue, which I think is broadly relevant, not just in the developing world, but also in developed countries, or certainly, I can speak from the US system, which I'm more familiar with, is the issue around what is education for? What is it preparing kids to be able to do? And I think this is another key piece, which is also needs a lot of work. There's a lot of discussion around 21st century, skills. And with all due respect to technology, which is a key piece for it, I think one of the unfortunate things is it's actually somewhat assumed that those two things are synonymous, and they're not. It's not just about technology. It's a huge and critical piece, but there's actually, I think, three major levels that we have seen really be important and directly relate to the employability. That's certainly one of them is the critical thinking, knowledge, skills, and things like obviously literacy, technology, the basic fundamental core skills. Also creativity falls into that, which is unfortunately being lost in many countries now with less and less options for art or music or other things in schools that actually help to foster creativity in ways that allow you to use your critical thinking and encourage kids to think out of the box. That's still a core area. But the other key aspects of 21st century skills are really interpersonal, intrapersonal skills. And this directly, I think, relates to a lot of the employability skills as well. So when you're talking about intrapersonal, it's the ability to have a work ethic, time management, dedication, understanding what you need to do when you are trying to achieve a goal, and setting goals and being able to achieve them for yourself. And then the interpersonal is obviously being able to do that within complex, diverse groups, being able to succeed in a team, being able to communicate, lead, manage, all of those things. And unfortunately, our schools are failing massively in these areas. If it's failing already in the basic, foundational skills, then, it's really not even starting. And this would be, again, the case in a lot of developing and developed countries, approaching some of the issues of how do you really prepare kids to leave school and be ready to take on jobs. And it's not just vocational skills are one certain key aspect of that, but it's also the ability to, to perform well within a work environment, whatever that work environment is. It could be a small business, it could be a large, that you run yourself, it could be, a large company. And so one of the things that Room to Read has gotten more and more involved in, and a lot of nonprofits have, are what they call life skills. And this is helping the public education system to bring in a lot of these skills around problem solving, communication skills, leadership skills, critical thinking. In the developing world, it's often also financial savviness, health and hygiene, all sorts of issues that come up. And so that's an area that we, particularly our girls' education program, now have a program where we work with the girls from about 5th grade all the way to 12th grade. And we do a lot of extracurricular workshops outside of school because they're not getting this within the formal educational environment. And that has become very critical in their success to be able to navigate and make key life decisions that set them up for success. So it's a complex ecosystem again that Women's works in. I think we partner. We're all public, all private funding from companies, foundations, and individuals. We're not government funded, so we face the issues of trying to find partners who can also create the vision that we have to work within the government system to help kids be more ready to take on the life decisions they have.
Why is it that you are, as an organization, are capable or more capable of bringing this into the public school system than, so the education minister saying, this is what we need in our school curriculum?
It's a great question. Sort of, what is the role of a nonprofit, in this? We see it as we're sort of a social catalyst for change. We can bring, oftentimes, global best practices. We can bring know-how. We can bring extra resources. We can help create an environment where change can be brought into the schools, but the sustainability of it is to be able to work within a system that can absorb and sustain that. And so that's why we have chosen within the primary and secondary school environment to work within the government system, because we can't recreate a separate system outside of the government. At the end of the day, to reach the most underserved and certainly majority of kids, you need to have an ability to work at scale. And so I think for nonprofits, our role is to help bring in new thinking, to challenge the system, to bring in new resources, but to make sure that you're working within a system that is sustainable. And that's a big challenge, because it's the good, the bad, and the ugly of working within the government system. It has some level of a system, but there's often they're not as embracing of change or new ideas.
Yeah, and when you're working within these countries, you're mainly in Asia. And in Africa, Asia and Africa, there are huge inequalities in education in these countries, which is probably one of the big issues. It's not that the whole of the system is bad, it's that there are good bits and bad bits. How do you work with that? Do you try to bring parts of the system together, or are you trying to work with the poor bits and bring them up? What's your approach to?
Yeah, without getting maybe too philosophical, but to step back from, education is an interesting idea. The concept of public education is that you can better yourself by, in learning. But there's different views of that, right? There's a very conservative view, which is it should just pretty much mirror the status quo in society. Wealthier people can go to better schools, and they're, deemed to be able to get, that's their right, in some ways. That can be a very conservative view. A more liberal view is there should be, an equality of access, right? And that's sort of where most of the world sort of falls now, that, by providing, quality education, in a wide spectrum across the country that everyone has access to, then it's really about your own effort and will to succeed within that system that propels those who are able to go forward, and it's not based on an economic or kind of social status. But a more progressive view of taking that is that if you really want to change, and I would encourage us to think of this as we are here at the Zermatt Summit, to think about what you really need to do to actually change and create more change in society, is you actually need to overinvest in areas that potentially are at a disadvantage. Maybe there's an ethnic or a linguistic or a economic or a gender, whatever that inequity is. The more progressive view of education is that if you pour more resources into it, because they're already at a disadvantage from day one of showing up in school, that you can perhaps help to equalize or create more opportunities for success. And I think that's a key element of, kind of why do we do what we do? Why is it important? Is to be able to shine the light on the needs that are in some of these very marginalized communities, and how do you, and actually your example of autism and the work that you're doing there is another area. You can define that, that marginalized community in many ways, right? But how do you actually provide additional training to equalize the playing field?
Okay, we'll look at what you want to do and how you're collaborating later. Let me just move on to Philippa. You're working also in an NGO working with disadvantaged kids, but outside of the the educational system. Can you sort of give me your reflections on
Sure.
what the successes and challenges are of that?
Yeah, so of course, like you say, we're working with those young people who, although, as Erin says, the education system globally is typically improving, there is a long way to go, and there are a lot of young people who either have not had access to that education system or have been failed by it or have exited from it early and are in a situation as adolescents where they've been outside the system for some time and they are in that position where they need to find their way into either employment or into business or some kind of income generating activity. And they are typically very poorly served by what systems do exist. There are a number of local NGOs, there are a number of vocational training institutes around the world, and we typically work in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And there are organizations out there who are attempting to address this issue, but who are typically doing so in a kind of a slight vacuum of information. They are not necessarily aware or able to do the research to find out what the market needs, and yet they're training young people to enter that market. So we've done a number of studies in a number of countries, in Ethiopia and Sierra Leone, in India and Nepal, looking at what the market actually needs, both in terms of the employers and what skills they need in order to be able to take young people into their entry-level opportunities, but also looking at the market for individual enterprises. Because what you find is lots of young people either are formally excluded from employment opportunities because of not having a high school certificate or not having reached some kind of specific standard established by employers, or they're excluded because there is a mutual misunderstanding and a mutual mistrust between marginalized young people and large-scale employers. The young people are frightened by the environment, find it very intimidating, and don't feel that they would fit in. The employers think that the young people are inexperienced and they don't have the right attitude to work, and etc. And therefore, formal employment appears to be off the agenda for this group, and therefore they turn to individual enterprise, which is actually what Street Kids International has been working on for 15 years, is supporting young people who are not able to enter the formal employment market, to support them to start viable, safe, sustainable, legal microenterprises. Because with the best will in the world, although we do have economies that are growing and increased numbers of employment opportunities in some countries, A, they're not necessarily accessible to all, and B, in lots of countries, that just isn't the case. And a large percentage of the population is in the informal market. But what you find is young people who look around them, they see that their friend is selling vegetables or shining shoes or selling ground nuts or whatever it is, and they want to do that because they see that their friend is doing that. And the vocational training centers aren't in a position, they don't have the information because they haven't done the research to be able to say, but actually, there is an opportunity here. This town really does need X, Y, and Z. So we did a study in Sierra Leone in 5 key cities that found that there were key opportunities. There were opportunities for young people to start themselves up as satellite system installers, as solar panel installers, but none of the vocational training centers were training in those skills because they didn't know that those needs were there. So we were able to work with those vocational training centers, support them to start relevant training programs, and integrate alongside the technical skills, the employability skills, the enterprise skills, so that a young person is not just learning how to install the satellite system, but is learning how to treat the customer, how to deal with the money, how to be presentable, turn up on time, communicate effectively, all of these things that go to making an effective employee or an effective individual entrepreneur, somebody who's able to manage their own business in that world. And 100% of the young people who started those satellite installation system training courses, 100% of them went into formal employment in a market that just previously didn't exist. So the opportunities are there to make that match, but the systems currently don't always allow for those connections to be made. We don't have local training centers aren't able to conduct the research to identify the needs. Local vocational training centers, we did a similar study in Ethiopia. There's a textile industry in Ethiopia that's crying out for employees. There are vocational training centers that will tell you they are training people to work in the textile industry, but their machinery is so outdated that the young people are being trained on obsolete technology, and then they go to try and get a job. The employers don't want them, but there are matches that can be made. There are relationships that can be built between those industries, those NGOs, those vocational training centers, to serve the needs of all of those people, to serve the young people's needs, to serve the NGOs' needs to achieve better results, and to serve the needs of business, to have effectively trained and sourced young people entering their doors who become motivated employees, who reduce attrition rates, whose presence in the workplace, as we were hearing earlier, improves morale in the existing employees, provides opportunities for those existing employees to develop management skills, leadership skills in working with these new entrants. So there's lots that can be done in partnership, but there's a big challenge out there for sure, I would say.
Okay, that's very interesting way you're describing the skills gap there. I mean, sometimes the skills gap is seen as something that is, you need years of university education in order to get the skills that are needed for a gap. That you're talking about a skills gap that is very tangible and manageable and changeable.
Practical skills,
practical skills,
practical
that
technical
needed,
skills,
and
the
life
employability skills, which
now,
are very much trainable.
Okay, so how do you go about working with companies to define exactly what the skills are they need? Mm-hmm. And how, and maybe also from the business side, our panelists could come in on this as well. What should businesses be doing to define this? I mean, I have sat with a lot of people from big companies talking about the war of talent and the difficulty of it. And it is really amazing to see the skills gap getting bigger and bigger, and it's clearly a big issue. But it's not going to be just coming from education. It's also going to have to be coming from companies looking at the way that they get the skills they need, define the skills they need, make sure they're coming up in the market, and then also participate in training. You want to talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. So what we have started, and we really had issues finding talents, especially in Brazil and China. So we started our own vocational training in Brazil and in India and also now in China, where we take young kids or young people into a vocational training over 24 months, working very closely with universities to ensure that they do have the skills, especially in IT, that we do need afterwards to be able to employ them. As an example.
Yes, no, yeah. Thank you.
I think, from what we've seen, and we've piloted a program in India and in the Philippines, which is very much a kind of three-way partnership between ourselves as experts in delivery of the employability and the enterprise skills, with local NGOs who know their youth population, know the challenges, are able to recruit and select effectively from their local populations, and with local employers who have these needs and are able to provide work experience, who are able to provide in-house mentoring for young people going into paid placements. They're able to provide advice for them and support for them if they're then going on to make job applications elsewhere. So there are models there for what can work. Thinking about it on a broader scale, I think you're right. I think employers need to be really clear about what it is that they need in their entry-level staff. And obviously there are also, I'm talking very much about this entry level, I'm not talking about university graduates and what have you. There are obviously challenges at that level too. But thinking about the kind of the stage down from that, if you like, it's it's very possible for an employer to be very explicit about what they need in that stuff. But I think we were talking earlier about sometimes actually an employer needs to take a step back and think about what do they really need to do those jobs. Often there are these kind of arbitrary requirements. You must have a high school certificate. Why is that? Why do you have to have a high school certificate? Is it something you learned in high school that you're going to apply in your job? Probably not in a lot of these instances. Is it more important that you are willing to turn up on time and be presentable and be willing to learn and all of these things? Those things are probably a lot more valuable. And if employers can communicate what they really need and maybe survey the market beyond their own needs, but think about other employers in the area. And then I think it's about building relationships with the vocational training centers, with the local NGOs, and communicating what's needed so that it can be provided, and investing. If a vocational training center is using obsolete machinery, then maybe the current employers could invest in providing the up-to-date machinery on which employees could be trained, and therefore they could be provided with, employees who would be a sound investment and would stay with the organization and so on.
Yeah. Did you want to?
Quickly, and I can only talk, about people who come from university because 90% we employ people who have been studying, but we give quite a bit to universities about the programs, about the newest technology, so that they are all trained on, we have a University Alliance program with 1,200 universities in it, and that's exactly what we do. So we give them the newest software so that they are trained, and then they can be employed on the market.
Okay. Is it?
Saying, that definitely does happen at a university level, both in Europe and in the emerging markets.
Yeah.
There is an investment in the relationship with universities, but there's also a need for a sector of employees who don't need a university education, and therefore that relationship could be mirrored with VCTs and NGOs, etc.
Thank you. Serena.
We haven't quite gone as far as admitting that we don't need people who have a university education. We don't necessarily struggle to get talent, but what is a challenge for us is having a diverse workforce. And so one of the things, for example, that we're starting to do differently in the UK is now recruit people who are graduating from high school, from underprivileged areas, and give a 6-year contract whereby they do their university degree at the same time as they are studying with us to become a chartered accountant. So it's a small thing that we're doing, but it's starting to get that diversity into our workforce, and it's been particularly popular because the UK just radically increased our university tuition fees from about $3,000 a year to about $9,000.
Yes.
And one other view of this I was just going to bring in is one of the things that is a large and growing sector in many of the countries, so-called developing countries, is actually the nonprofit sector itself is quite vibrant and
Yes.
quite growing. And one of the areas that has worked really well for Madrid, and I can actually use KPMG as an example, is when companies that have a broad, look at CSR, and part of that is grant making, but part of that is also bringing the skills and talent of your own workforce and to help train the nonprofit sector working in the country. So for Room to Read, out of 630 employees that we have worldwide, full-time Room to Read employees, 85% of them are in Asia and Africa, local nationals in the countries that we work in. And actually our hardest challenge is actually finding talent in the countries that we work in because of the lack of the education system. And so having people, and KPMG has done this for a couple of years with us in Africa, come from businesses and help train our staff and help do projects where they're there for a couple of weeks. We've had companies who have seconded people for 6 months. But ways to actually invest in the nonprofit sector is a great way to both have employee engagement as well as to really help boost the skills within the countries themselves.
Yeah. Before we move on to some of the educational initiatives you're doing, I'd just like to open out to the floor if any of you would like to discuss any of these questions that we've been discussing in the developing areas. Is there anybody? Yes, please. Yeah. Is there a microphone? Maybe not, if you can shout. Yeah. This one here.
I also think that it's a great opportunity, and I know it's not from an individual level for the person who is employed right now, so that please bear in mind that I'm talking from a macro level. But I also see that having such a big potential workforce, educated workforce, but also that the workforce that is now is a huge potential for us to be able to change these structures that we were talking about in the earlier session, that we think that it's almost impossible to change or humanizing globalization in the existing structures. Now I think that if we as a society and with the capabilities that we have to really help train these young people to be entrepreneurs, I think that there's a great potential for making smaller groups of individuals that can coexist with the global world and the corporate world. So I think that's also really good angle. So I know from the individual point of view that is unemployed and looking for a job here and now, it's definitely not saying it's a great thing. But if we're going to, for example, with my organization, I do leadership, inspirational key speeches, trainings, and sparring partners for politicians and for top executives. And one Tuesday evening per month, I take all of the clients' children, and I invite them to my training center, and I teach them about their own energy and their own capacity, because they're not taught about their own capacity. And for me, every time they walk out, you see these young people, the way that they straighten their back and walk out of there, they know that they can change the world. And I just wish that we could do that for all young individuals, not only grown-ups. Because when you see these kids, like they're from the age of 7 up to 17, they're just change just from 2 hours of being told that they can change the world. I think that's an opportunity.
And that's also about teaching life skills and in school. My son was doing some exercises. He's 14 this year in French or something. And one of the questions that he had to do was translate, "My father has lost his job, therefore we are living in poverty." And I thought, this is teaching a kind of dependence on a world, or a lack of independence and ability to find your own opportunities that is really very shocking. And I found it very interesting that you're bringing these skills very firmly into the most 21st.
I fully agree with what you're saying. And the other piece of that is that we as a society, almost every society in the world, very much underappreciates the role of a teacher. And the teacher comes in many forms, but they are some of the most challenging jobs. It's the most unrespected and underappreciated, profession out there. And I think it's so sad, because when you talk about who's interacting with our children and who's giving them these life skills, this confidence, et cetera, it's largely a fairly undertrained, worn down, beaten down, underpaid teacher who faces that every day, whether it's in a formal or informal setting. And I think that's something as if we talk about how to change the world, really changing our view of values of our teachers is critical.
I'd be interested to hear from you. You obviously are reflecting on the educational system and what it does, can and cannot do, or does and does not do at present. And the teachers are very important in that. And if you look in Africa, one of the biggest problems is that the teachers just don't turn up and don't themselves have the skills to be able to teach. How do you think that could be best tackled? Because we can't tackle this entirely outside of the system. How can we make sure? What is the role there for NGOs, for business, in helping raise the standard of the teachers? Is that something we can do, or is that?
I'll say one thing on attendance of teachers to start with. This is maybe a bit of an extreme example, because it's when I was working in South Sudan, which had just shortly before come out of 22 years of civil war. But most of the teachers were not turning up to work, and lots of volunteer teachers were turning up that actually weren't being paid. And there were a lot of people that were being paid for teaching, and yet no one even knew about them. So the most successful thing that we were able to do, I was working then in the NGO sector, was to get the donors to provide funding for a private consultancy that then worked with the government to establish a payroll. Unfortunately, now the oil has been turned off again, so I'm sure they're not being paid. But that kind of structural change is much, much more important than anything that we can do at individual kind of school or community level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that as a business community, one of the things that, whether good or not, you have an ability to insert influence. And what needs to be changed is the government accountability to invest in education at a greater level, to ensure that there are all of the things that we're talking about, economic opportunities, prosperity, et cetera. Governments are oftentimes the most corrupt player in the educational system, and yet still the largest provider of it. So it's a complex issue, but holding them accountable for paying teachers, for educating, providing the education that is required. All of us live in countries that give quite a lot of money, actually, internationally, to help support initiatives around education. Mm-hmm. I mean, the great failure in Africa has not been a lack of attention, it's been a lack of accountability. There's been actually quite a lot of money poured into Africa, but there's not been a lot of accountability of where that money has gone and what results have been achieved. And so a lot of it is, I think, the partnership of the private sector, the public sector, and then groups like NGOs who can be part of that accountability system to make sure it gets done.
The two things that we do to support teachers are, firstly, we do a lot of mentoring, not only with children, but with teachers. And we also have a lot of volunteers who sit on boards of governors, which I'm sure many of your organisations do as well. So in the UK, we have at least 150 governors. And then we also try to provide sponsorship where we can see there's a clear need for a teacher in a particular subject. So, for example, in Haiti, we fund a professor of construction and a professor of NGO administration for the duration of the 3-year course.
Could you? Sorry, yes.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's a similar question, but different people.
Just introduce
yourself. Sorry, yes,
everybody.
I'm Carla Colonet from WWF, and I'm interested to know, so if we imagined we had teachers turning up and they were highly skilled, but then how do you ensure that girls do turn up? Because to me it seems like it's part of a huge system of cultural change, religious attitudes, and changes in the community. So how are you tackling that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges of education is there are not a lot of silver bullets, as we all know. It's about continuous improvement over time that makes changes. And I wish we could invent a pill that educated children after a vaccination or 5 doses. Unfortunately, it requires years of hard work. So similarly, when you talk about gender, you're absolutely right. There's so many aspects to it: societal, religious, economic. All of those have influences. I mean, oftentimes in the communities that we're working in, families want to send all their kids to school, but there are actual economic barriers to that, and they pick who they think is going to be able to succeed the most in employment, and is going to be able to therefore take care of the family, which is often the eldest male children. So it is a huge challenge that you're battling. But I think what we have seen over time is that by tackling it from a very practical perspective, when you look at things like improving health, when you look at every year that a girl stays in secondary school, her earning potential goes up by 20%, every year. So she gets to the end of 12th grade, it absolutely changes the economic situation for her family. When you look at many aspects around investing in education, you can make the argument that one of the best investments is to invest in women and girls. And so I think part of what we're trying to do is come at it, not necessarily against religious or social values, but through the sort of view that at a very practical level, if there is an ability to be more inclusive around gender, then it's better for everyone. It's better for the family. It's better for the community. It brings benefits, that are very real and tangible. And that's, for most of the communities that we're working in. And we're not, I will fully admit that we're not, for example, in Afghanistan or some of the countries that have, more challenges, religious and other challenges. But we do work in, for example, Bangladesh, which is largely Muslim, and there's certainly long-held beliefs. But even those beliefs are changing as the reality, as the world kind of does come together and merges in many of its values through communication, through technology. People understand that to succeed, there needs to be some way to enter the employment market for both men and women.
And are you seeing a big improvement in those since you've been working in these countries?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, well, and countrywide is as hard as a nonprofit, but certainly communities that we're working in, we have started to track kind of the secondary, impact we're having that is resulting not only in the girls in the program in our schools, but what you see in communities is that becomes a ripple effect. When more girls start to go to school, others don't want to be left out, so they start sending their kids to school because they can see that times are changing and they don't want to be the families that don't educate their children.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things you're talking about, the Muslim impacts, is to see in the Gulf countries, where obviously money is not the issue at all. It's the girls who are starting to do much better at the university. Universities are about 75% girls. And I was just looking for something else in detail at the statistics there. And what was interesting to see is that although they dropped out of the public universities, which are lower quality in general, fairly in a greater proportion than the men, in the private universities where the standards were higher and more demanding, they actually had a much higher success rate than the men did. So I thought it was quite interesting.
I think it's important also to recognise that there is now gender parity in most countries in primary school enrolment, but it's the girls that are dropping out very early. And part of it is related to big issues around poverty, water collection, family sickness when they're responsible for the burden of care, needing to go out to work, etc. But generally, the biggest issue is when they come to reproductive age. And so, the girls said to me, in South Sudan, for instance, that once they start bleeding, they have no way to manage it. And so simple things like building latrines and washrooms in schools as a matter of good practice can make a huge difference, because they then stay home, for those days. They get behind their nearly all male teachers, ridicule them, and then everyone knows also that they're available for marriage. And I think we need to be careful when we talk about culture to distinguish what is truly culture and what actually is just practice.
I think one of the interesting initiatives is Procter & Gamble working together with Save the Children to provide female hygiene products to help girls stay in school also during these days. So it has a very, very practical impact there.
Save the Children estimated for Africa alone the cost of not educating girls to the same standard as boys costs the economy about $90 billion a year. There's a big case for it.
Yes. Are there any more questions from the floor at the back there, Guido? Sorry, we are blinded by these lights if we keep looking like this.
Guido Palazzo. I think we should not always look that far, because we have similar problems in Europe. Maybe with a little bit of difference in that we are not lacking education. We have great education in many countries, but once the students drop out of university, they find no job. So we have this so-called lost generation in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, and everywhere. A generation of young people who will never find a job, who grow up without any kind of self-confidence, full of rage and frustration, and when they grow old, they do not even have a pension. So what do we do in Europe in order to deal with that problem?
Thank you, Guido. You moved me on to the next section. So, Anka, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I would love to take that, because just building up on that, we see that the IT sector is one of the sectors where there's still growth also in regards to positions, but the EU figured out that we have about 900,000 open positions that we are not going to be able to fill because we don't have the right qualifications. So a couple things. We are very much trying to get more interest in the, I always have to look it up because the English one, in the STEM jobs. So that's, the ones in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we do that by inviting more people, by having our employees go to schools, go to universities and talk about it. Now, coming back to your questions, what we just started is something which is called which is Academy Cube, and it's an e-learning platform for unemployed young people in Spain, in Greece, and in Portugal. And we hope to take about 100,000 people through that still this year with our partners. And what we are doing is we really teach them a lot of IT skills. Partly it's an online platform, but partly we also work with the Arbeitsämter, so the ones who also give out the positions, where we say, so these are the kind of qualifications you need, and this is what we can offer in regards to educating you here, and to really help these people, unemployed people in Greece, especially Portugal and Spain. So that would probably be an example where we don't have to go so far away.
What do you see as the biggest causes of the problem here? And what is causing this skills gap? Is it that Europe has been outsourcing, it's not just Europe, the States as well, outsourcing the lower skilled jobs, and so we're left only with the higher skilled jobs? Is it that there is a gap that's grown between the educational system and companies, so that we have the same thing that you're talking about in Asia, where there's just a lack of knowledge about what is needed and what is available and what should we train? How do you diagnose
Partly,
that
I
skills
think it
gap?
is, yeah. I think, we probably don't focus enough in the education on these kind of positions, on technology. We talked about teachers and the qualification of teachers. Teachers, just by the nature of their education, usually is not that much IT technology, because it's more the social parts behind it, what you need to be a very good teacher. And I think we need more role models out there. We need to be a lot more open with that, and I think we also have to communicate a lot more honest to young people that, IT skills is something that you do need in the future.
Yes, please.
Well, I was going to say, I think what we haven't really touched on is, sort of, are there ways to be disruptive in terms of delivering education that could result in better ways of delivering high quality education, relevant education, and at a cost point that may be more scalable and achievable. And obviously, I think that's where technology can play a huge role, and perhaps in the sense of retraining or giving people new skills if they are currently don't have employable skills. And I think that's a really interesting place. I mean, Room to Read's headquarters, I'm based in San Francisco. So, you can walk down the street in Silicon Valley and every other person is working on some disruptive, interesting idea in how to change the way, we interact. A lot of them around education, actually. Just, to point out one that we're working with is the Khan Academy, which many people might have heard of. But, the Khan Academy is working on a platform where they deliver via video a lot of very, accessible, easy to watch, fun, and they do it in a very, very wide range of topics, but very, quick videos. And they're now piloting this both in the U.S. and in several developing countries, where they actually are having the children watch the videos at home as their homework. What child does not want to go home and be told you have to, watch some videos? I mean, that's, fun. They get pretty good results, and they actually track the children individually as to where they are, having challenges, where they go back and rewatch, how they progress through a subject level. And have testing, but then they use a classroom time where teachers are then coaches and facilitators, and there's a lot more collective interaction in peer groups, and the teacher does not have to know everything, doesn't have to be an expert on every single subject, because that is becoming more and more difficult. But they can be able to look at where children need to go back and review, can set up and encourage children. One of the most important roles of the teacher is actually just to be, back to this topic, to be the one who encourages you to strive, who believes in children, that they can achieve something, that value children, value their ideas. And that time in the classroom is actually what they're calling flipping the classroom. And so I think some of these ideas will be really interesting ways that could, and lots of universities are doing this now more and more, much more open platforms, like MIT, Harvard, et cetera. I mean, it's amazing. You can pretty much get a Harvard education for the cost of nothing now. In the last couple of years, almost every Harvard course now is online and accessible. And so it's an amazing way to think about how could we actually get the skills that we need and have it at a delivery cost and impact that is far greater than the traditional view of a school being four walls.
Just to build on that, it's also a possibility now for people with autism to improve their education, because of a lot of times they were not able to sit in a classroom at university with a lot of people. Now, if they can take the online trainings, and we're also working on leveraging that a lot more, it helps them also to get a higher qualification and to be better employed afterwards.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I think, in a lot of European markets, the growth has got to come through the SME sector. So we do a lot of, mentoring and business coaching with owners of small businesses, and I would encourage everyone to get your organizations to do more as well. I know many people are actively involved in it. And then another initiative we have is we co-funded an academy in Hackney with the government, which is one of the most underprivileged areas in London. And we have so many staff that want to volunteer to work alongside the teachers and the students there that we can't actually absorb the numbers. But one of the innovations is that the children help to run the school like a business. So different parts of the school, like the canteen, are all set up so that they make decisions about how can they raise funding, how's the money going to be spent, etc. What kind of events can they organize, and we're finding that it's working really well and everyone loves it, our people as well as the teachers and the students. And a lot of the students in that area now are third generation of, in a family who've never ever had a job.
From the point of view of KPMG, what are you trying to do with your, what is the common thread of your educational initiatives? Are they trying to solve specific problems, or have you got a view of where, how you're going to tackle the skills shortages that you face?
We focus on areas of marginalisation primarily because it makes us very nervous that if we don't address these issues, then the world's becoming a very dangerous place. These needs are not something that we can ignore. Even in Africa, there are 10 to 12 million young people that are entering the jobs market every year. What happens if they can't be absorbed? So I think it's about a bigger understanding of this is a major issue for the world in which we are a global citizen. So it's in our self-interest to do this.
Okay. Yes, please. There's a microphone here.
Marcello Palazzi, Progress Foundation in the Netherlands. A question about the scale of the issue that we face with here. Employability, creating jobs for all these millions of next generation people. How have any of you, particularly perhaps SAP and KPMG, how are you actually working with, if you're working with other corporations in a more systemic way, so that not just SAP on its own or KPMG on its own, but do you actually have, and you mentioned business in the community, are there actually initiatives that are run by several businesses working together in sync to actually tackle this issue?
So I would start with the one I mentioned before, the Academy Cube. So we just started that with a couple other big DAX companies, but also with the job agencies to have a long-term involvement there. And I think we are right now 12 companies that are involved there, where we really, use this e-learning platform to get more people into technology. That would be one example. Yeah.
Nearly everything that we're involved in is with other companies and organisations. So in the UK, there's a consortium of professional services organisations, banks, etc., that provide mentoring and work placements to people from underprivileged backgrounds. In Kenya, together with many of our clients, we're part of something called the Global Give Back Circle, which provides funding and mentoring to girls to encourage them to go on to tertiary education. So that, nearly everything is in partnership with other companies.
I think the question of systemic change, I think it's important to bring in the public sector, if you will, as well. The government sector, more specifically, because I think the challenge is that while there are challenges working with the governments, at the end of the day, one of the best ways that businesses and nonprofits can help is if you embrace the fact that a certain level of education really is delivered mostly by the government, right? And you can even argue with private institutions, a lot of them are leading the way, but they're following a broad framework in which oftentimes there are state or your national policies under which they're working. And I think in many ways we're leaving behind the government in some of these discussions, which is probably not going to be very healthy for systemic change. And the question is there, in my mind, is there, are there certain things that are sort of public goods? I mean, are things like education, healthcare, you can argue different types of infrastructure. Are these things that we want our governments to provide at a certain level and sort of demand that? And thus, how do we help them to remain sort of current and relevant and efficient? And so I think, some of the panelists, this morning have been talking about moving from different sectors, private sector moving more into the public sector and taking time to bring new ideas and to, invest, to having more partnerships and all of these things. I think, KPMG and SAP are both doing that, but that's, I think, an area where all of these things cannot just be done by the private sector only, because at the end of the day, their job to a certain extent is also to, earn money for their shareholders, right? But there is a role then perhaps for the government sector, whose job is, should be to provide, great services. That I don't think have invested enough in, and I think that at least, certainly in the countries that we work in, and certainly in the United States, and I think there is not enough accountability for the government to actually have to get more engaged in the education delivery and improve it.
What is your direct experience? So if you're working with the government on these things, what are the biggest challenges to that relationship that you have to making that into a productive relationship? I mean, like the Khan Academy has been working with public schools also in California, I know, and that's it sounds like, I mean, I haven't seen it actually, but it sounds like quite a productive collaboration to take what a school can do and what the teachers can do and then use these other aspects. Are you able to have that kind of dialogue in the countries that you're working in? Or is there a kind of block from the
I mean, it varies widely. I think so. The quality of the government and it can vary widely within a country as well. When you talk about local levels of government or more state and provincial levels, so it's not it's hard to in brushstrokes I think talk, because you can find countries that we're in, such as Nepal, which de facto has no government. Essentially, it's been sort of had internal strife for over 15 years now. And then you can find countries like India that we work in that has, a lot of government presence, like Vietnam, which is, a communist country and everything is essentially the government. So there's such a wide, variety of that. But what we have found is, at the end of the day, most of the governments that we work with embrace the fact that they don't have both the know-how or the resources to provide high quality education. And so you can get to a place if you invest the time in the relationships and build the trust and demonstrate models at low cost points and that are cost effective, that governments can scale. You can get governments on board with you. I think the challenge is if you bring oftentimes a very expensive model. It's sort of like we don't really need the Mercedes-Benz version of education. We need the Hyundai version of education for most of the countries that we're working in. If you embrace the fact of being able to work and prove models within low cost points that are scalable, that have high quality results, governments oftentimes will very much embrace that. Unfortunately, a lot of the constraints to aid and education come with very high cost points. They're often, our own governments are putting very high restrictions around the type of people you employ, the delivery of services that have to embrace. I can speak from, sort of some of the government aid, certain types of carriers that you have to use that are, American carriers or American suppliers or, et cetera. All of our governments put these constraints on it that actually, and also a lot of the educational materials are sold by private companies that have an investment, and thus once they actually start to charge the government are quite high for the delivery of the educational materials. And all of these things make it a very complex system that is not really sustainable and is quite expensive to deliver. So.
Yes, please.
The other thing that I wanted to, just as we've moved on to introduce the government into this sort of partnership discussion, is to draw us back to the idea of the government role in facilitating enterprise as well as employability, and the role that they have with the private sector when we're not talking about the multinationals, we're talking about the SMEs or the individual enterprises, and the role that is crucial for a government to play in facilitating the startup, the funding, and the growth of those microenterprises, which is where young people end up when they can't find jobs. They will be running microenterprises, whether it's legally or illegally, sustainably or unsustainably. And there's a role that the government and NGOs particularly, but also with facilitation and support from the bigger business sector, can play in making that a more viable option for young people for whom formal employment is not an option, or is perceived to be not an option.
What exactly is the government role there? Is it in providing funding, or is it in providing the framework that allows that to happen more?
It's a lot about framework and regulation or deregulation, particularly for marginalized young people starting up in business. We see countries like Brazil and India who are making efforts to formalize and kind of become more structural, with the best of intentions, wanting to make it easy to start small businesses. But as soon as you try to formalize it, you make a certain sector of the population essentially act illegally in order to be able to do something. So it's a legal requirement in Brazil to have an identity card in order to register your business. If you don't have an identity card, you can't get one, so therefore your business is illegal all of a sudden. And this is a government who is making efforts to move in the right direction, and is moving in the right direction in lots of ways, but there's a role to be played in, I think, by NGOs to educate the government about the reality, in some cases, of what is going on the ground with the hardest to reach and the poorest of the poor, who are excluded from those wonderful government schemes where you need a high school education in order to access the scheme that will help you get a job. That's great for some people, but again, it excludes the people at the bottom of the pyramid. So that I think there's a role, and I think there's a role that business can play in advocating for that with governments. And obviously every government is completely different. And that's, there are examples from the good, the bad, and the ugly, for sure.
Can business play that role? It's actually quite a difficult one, because you're talking about a sort of acceptance of a level of informality that is probably quite difficult for businesses to accept, isn't it? Business people.
I mean, I think it doesn't, if you enable a young person to formalize in a legal way, then you don't have to be talking about a scary level of informality. But what we're talking about is a scenario where it's very difficult for a young person to formalize, therefore they're forced into illegality.
Okay, so it's about supporting there. Is that an area that you've worked in?
No, I'm not sure why it would be a problem to business, because those people may, through a very, very long series of links, be in global supply chains, but on the whole, they're not going to be. But again, of course, I'm talking with my big business mindset.
Right. Are there any more questions around here? Guido, yes. I'd also like to ask you, Guido, how you see the educational sector, since you're in it, changing.
Oh, that's a big discussion in itself. But I think that the MOOCs, these massive open online courses that were already mentioned, they are a kind of Gutenberg situation for the universities. They will completely destroy the whole industry of education and change it. Until the 1970s, IBM had a guarantee in its code of ethics code, that where they wrote, "We guarantee the jobs of our people." The last century was a century where we talked about employment. Now we talk about employability. And there are a lot of good reasons to do so, but there's a dark side of the force here. Because if we talk about employment, and there is no employment, the question of who is responsible is mostly answered by governments and corporations. If we say we move from employment to employability, and I have no job, then it's because I'm too stupid, I'm not clever enough, I have the wrong formation, I'm in the wrong place, so it's me. It's my personal problem. It's no longer my community's problem. And I think this is something we should keep in mind when we talk about employability. There is this risk that we shift too much responsibility to individuals who cannot find jobs, how good they are with their formation. If I can again take the Italian context, there's so many brilliant young people, they find no work. It has nothing to do with having the wrong formation. It has to do with the old people keeping the jobs, being corrupt, not creating new ones. It's not them. So for me here, it's more about employment, not about employability.
Would you like to address that? It's interesting. It's a question of whether
I just said that's a very, very good point.
It's a very good point, yes. It's a question whether to what extent the skills gap is part of the problem, or whether in fact the jobs are not really there. And obviously the two things coexist. But I think the shift of responsibility question is very, very key. Is that something, I mean, obviously when you're teaching life skills, part of what you're teaching is to take the responsibility for your future and to take it as, you're the one then that is accountable for how do you deal with kids that then aren't able to get jobs?
I think from our perspective, Street Kids actually started working with young people without thinking about employability. Employability wasn't even on the radar. It was all about business for that very reason. It was about saying you can take responsibility for yourself, your income, your livelihood. You are probably not in a position to expect anyone else to take that responsibility for you. Because we started off working with young people who are living and working on the streets and would be considered by most companies, large or small, to be almost unemployable. So it was about putting that power in their hands as individuals to say, if you're excluded from these opportunities, here's a way you can make your way regardless. Now, we have since moved into saying, actually, we think that young people in that situation should be given opportunities to seek both enterprise opportunities and employment opportunities. But our whole methodology grew out of that very reality, that there aren't enough jobs for everybody, and therefore enterprise is the other option if you want to earn a living.
And how do you deal with it?
Well, I was going to say, I think this comes back to almost where we began, which is the vision that we're all working towards. Because I completely agree with what you're saying, Rita, which is it's all of our responsibilities. I mean, it's not just an individuals. It's not just a corporation. It's not just a government. I mean, only if we look at this as an ecosystem that works together and supports each other, and coming up with a shared vision that everyone deserves the right to have a full and successful life. That one aspect of that is education, but it's also the ability to apply that education, have the opportunity to be given a chance, to have the support. All of these things are key, right? So I think you have to come at it from all angles. And I guess, there's the systemic change. You can sometimes, I think, talk around in circles because it's hard. Then where do you start? It's a string, that you can pull from any angle, and I think that's the hard part. I think as nonprofits, oftentimes our jobs are just to go out and to try to be a demonstration of some successful models that hopefully then we can engage others in governments and businesses, to scale more. So it's sort of starting with something that is manageable to see some change, and that's where, with our girls' education program, for example, where we apply the life skills, you can see a very dramatic difference in a girl's level of confidence and her ability to speak up, or to ability to assert what she wants, to be able to create a vision for herself, of what that looks like, of what a successful life looks like. And will she be blocked many ways in achieving that? Yes, absolutely. But if she has some of the perseverance and determination, and feels empowered to speak up, then hopefully she can knock down at least a few of those barriers and get further ahead than if she didn't have some of those life skills.
Thank you. Any last questions before I get somebody? Yes, please.
Hi, Joanne Holm. We talked a lot about quality of education, the need to keep the services we provide relatively inexpensive, yet we see a huge pressure in terms of the increasing costs of education, especially in countries like the US. How do you think it affects our ability to deliver the quality education we strive to get to give the new generations?
Okay, who wants to answer that one?
I'd just like to take an example which I like quite a bit, and it's the Scandinavian countries. Because, if I think about Sweden, for example, every Swedish kid gets a funding from the state independently from the income of the parents, and especially if they go abroad, So, for example, if they go for 1 year to Singapore to study, they get even more money. So they get like 1,500 euros a month to be able to go abroad and to learn. And, you know, when we talk about diversity, understanding different cultures, this is a wonderful approach to do it compared to what the US is doing. So I just am very much in favor in this of the Scandinavian program, because I think it gives so many more equal rights. And I can also see that different kind of people come up. They are very independent also in their thinking, because they're independent also from their family home. And I think that's so important, that we have this independency, this freedom in thinking of the people that we want to pull into also into corporate life, because they really challenge a lot more, because of, you know, the freedom they grew up with.
Does that answer you, or are you talking about the cost of education to the society, to the governments? You into the individual? For the individual. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, again, I would go back to the concept of, you know, that education actually should be a basic human right, and it should be something that, you know, is a public good that everyone deserves has access to at a reasonable cost. And I think that, you know, for example, in my own country, we have gone, in many ways, slipped backwards in this area over the last couple of decades, and that, you know, the cost of education is has increased far faster than the cost of anything else actually in society, and thus limited its access. And we're now instead of moving towards more of a progressive, as I was talking about, concept of education, that, you know, you should be ensuring not only does everyone have equal access, but that underserved populations or marginalized populations have even more access. We've actually moved away from that and moved actually much, you know, back towards a couple of centuries ago, sort of the conservative view that it should just mirror the status quo of society, that, you know, poor people are going to be poor and wealthy people are going to be wealthy, and that's just the way it is. And you know, dog eat dog world, you just have to, you know, sort of survival of the fittest. And in many ways, and, you know, that is, I think, you know, a result probably to a certain extent of the fact that people don't feel that their opportunities are maybe shrinking, not growing, and so you have to protect, you know, yourself. You have to protect your status. You have to protect your place in society, your family's place, and it becomes much more of an individual decision. If I can, you know, get the private education or pay for the, you know, the better education, I will. And, you know, instead of looking at it as, you know, how can we have an equal, more, you know, equitable system. So I think it's in many ways probably not moving in the right direction, and certainly we're not, you know, a role model for quality, you know, building quality education system. And it's, you know, it's some very large systemic issues in terms of how resources are spent, what performance, you know, of teachers, and the systems that are the political systems that, you know, are put into place to make those determinations. So it's a very complex issue, but unfortunately I think it's moving backwards.
Any more questions there? Right, I'd like to finish off with each of you looking at what you would like what would help you to be able to scale the initiatives you have upwards, because you're all involved in some really interesting small initiatives that are, you know, getting larger. But what would help you to scale that? I mean, you know, I look at your autism one. Who wants to start with that? Erin, maybe we can start with you.
Well, I think, you know, the reality as a nonprofit is that, you know, the greatest constraint in terms of doing more of what we're doing are partnerships that help you, you know, disseminate and grow, and the funding, you know, to do that. So I think the ability to be able to partner with, you know, innovators, with, you know, creative organizations that are pushing the limits and being able to bring new ideas, you know, such as the examples that you have here, you know, is critical to being able to have those models of success that can demonstrate at, you know, a achievable cost point with, you know, measurable results. You can create new opportunities to have marginalized groups have high success in achieving education.
Thank you.
And what is helping, and, you know, that's what we learned, is, you know, focusing on the abilities everybody has. And I think I would come back to your point, and with that also grow the confidence of the young people. Because we do need more people who are confident also in corporate world, who really ask the tough questions, and not the ones who learned to adjust to the system. That's not what we want.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I would echo what Aaron was saying, and also what I was saying in the previous session, that once we have models that work and that work for mutual benefit for young people, for the community, and for business, clearly what would be really helpful would be corporate partners who are operating on a global scale and have employment opportunities in multiple markets, that we could use the pilot that we've done, roll it out further, and look specifically at measuring and proving the model and proving its value for the youth, for the community, and for the business itself. Because I think that's the way that we're going to kind of convince ourselves, each other, and everybody else that this is the way forwards. It's not just by sitting here and talking about it, but by demonstrating that there is value there for the business as well. It's not just a CSR activity or a kind of box-ticking activity. It's about creating value within the organization in terms of HR structures, in terms of reduced attrition, in terms of all kinds of personal development opportunities. So I think the demonstration piece is part of rolling it out, and it's almost as important as the rollout itself.
Thank you.
We already have such huge employee engagement in education employability, but what I'm going to take back to my office is we have a public sector advisory practice that do lots of educational reform projects for governments. And I think often what's missing is actually bringing the core of our business together with these discussions that are happening more in kind of citizenship forums. So that's where I think we might be able to have a larger impact and maybe convene something strategic, including governments as well as yourselves.
Thank you. Just 3 points from my side that I take away from this. One is, I think it's the whole question of what education is for and what we should be teaching our kids, and how is really, really important, one that needs to be part of a much broader dialogue that everybody needs to be involved in, the NGOs that are working in this sphere and businesses, but crucially with the public sector. I think the government's a very, very important role in there that we have to be careful not to sideline. What really struck me around the discussion was the need for defining the skills that we need, and for business to play a much more active role in defining what they need and how they can get that. So that there is really a significant role, rather than talking about the lacks, a much more active role in working on exactly what those skills are and how they can be developed. And the third thing is the risk that Guido was bringing up, but also in Europe there are major risks, but in Africa we're doubling the population in the next few decades. It's a major demographic bomb potential, but there is also, if you look at what happened in Asia, the statistic goes that it was the demographic dividend, the fact that there was a larger working age population over the last 20, 30 years, that brought 30% of the additional growth. So that in Africa, we need to focus particularly on making sure that doubling of the population doesn't leave a major gap for the young generation coming up. So, thank you very, very much for your participation. Thank you to all the participants. Before you applaud them, let me just tell you, because otherwise you won't hear, we're going into the next room. There'll be 15 minutes of wrap-up from Rodrigo Jordan, and then we're going on to drinks. So just, you're almost there. Your energy levels are no doubt waning at this point, but we'll be allowed out soon. So just 15 minutes. But thank you very, very much to all the panelists. Thank you.